Hello, everyone, and welcome to another very special episode of the Idea to Value podcast. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn, and I've been really looking forward to this interview for quite a long time. We have the honor of having with us today Dean Keith Simonton. He is the Distinguished Professor Emeritus in the Department of Psychology at the University of California, Davis. It's a bit of a mouthful, but you probably know him better as being the author of multiple books and multiple incredibly groundbreaking scientific studies on creativity and genius. So we're going to be talking about the link between genius and creativity today. A really big thank you. Dean, wonderful having you here today.
Well, thanks for having me here. I'm really looking forward to it.
Welcome to the Idea to Value podcast, where in every episode we highlight the latest insights into creativity and innovation from experts around the world. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn. I care about the evidence behind what makes ideas happen, and I've already helped thousands of people just like you through my unique insights into recent scientific findings of how creativity works. I also show you how to turbocharge innovation programs so they finally deliver on the value and ideas you've been struggling to execute. Get your free training on how creativity can be improved by registering now at www.ideatovalue.com. Now let's get on with today's episode. So for people who don't know about you, your work, could you just give us a very brief background as to how you got started in creativity research and how it brought you to where you are now?
Okay, it was kind of an unusual story because when I started studying creativity research focused on scores on creativity tests, on K through 12 and college, and often using divergent thinking measures. And I was more interested in creators that people would have no doubt are creative. In fact, you wouldn't even have to measure their creativity on a test. If I said Albert Einstein or Michelangelo, you would automatically think of them as being creative. It's just automatic. So I wanted to study people who were unquestionably creative, but I didn't want to do anything like psychobiography or whatever. There's plenty of psychobiographies. So Sigmund Freud did a psychobiography of Leonardo da Vinci. It was one of the first, in fact, because I didn't consider it to be very scientific. I wanted to have multiple cases. I wanted to collect the data from various biographical and historical sources. I wanted to quantify those data. And then I want to subject those quantifications to various kinds of data analyses and mathematical models. So my approach was very, very different. In fact, my dissertation actually used the methods used in econometrics, very quantitative and all that kind of stuff. I used a common econometrics program. So that's how I started. And the nice thing about it is that I'm studying, all of my samples have names associated with them that you would recognize. So that's how I got started. And I was warned by my advisors at Harvard that I hope you realize you won't get this stuff published, at least not in any good journal. And lo and behold, there was a niche for this kind of thing. People felt that there was a need for a quantitative approach to historical and biographical data. And so I actually ended up being very successful. I've published hundreds of articles. And so, and in good journals. I was told there was one journal that was considered to be the top tier journal in my field, and they say you would never publish in it. Well, my first 3 publications were in that journal. And of course, as soon as I got reprints, I sent my advisors at Harvard copies. So, So that's how it started.
It was this link between finding out the prominent creative geniuses, as we might call them in our society, that you were focusing on. What exactly were you trying to find, and what sort of findings did you end up getting?
Oh boy, as you mentioned, I've published lots of books and they're full of a lot of different discoveries. One of the things I think is very important is I got my PhD in social psychology. So I was interested originally in the social context, the social cultural context. And in fact, when I started grad school at Harvard, I was in the Department of Social Relations, which included sociology and cultural anthropology, as well as social psychology, developmental psychology, and personality psychology. So I wanted to find out, for example, is there a reason why geniuses tend to appear at certain times and places and not appear at other times and places? So we have like golden ages, like the golden ages of Athens, or the Italian Renaissance. And there's these periods before and after where creativity basically disappears. I mean, you'll have creativity, but it is at a very low level. And right now I'm reading Vasari's lives of painters, sculptors, and architects devoted to Renaissance Italy. And he talks
one
about
of the first books that obviously mentioned creativity for an individual rather than just being inspired by the muses or by jinns.
Exactly. And what's interesting is he spends a lot of time talking about how uncreative the predecessors of the Italian Renaissance were. They were just imitating each other. They were just doing more of the same thing. He called it the German manner. It wasn't so much German, is that it was Gothic.
Uh-huh.
And the Gothic manner was passé by then. You just didn't need more Gothic sculptures and more Gothic cathedrals. And so there was a recognition in Vasari's time, which of course includes Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, that we live in a special era right now, that this is a golden age. And you see a similar kind of thing that happened in Periclean Athens, where there was a recognition that Athenian sculpture and architecture was premier in the world. And so was Athenian philosophy, and so was Athenian drama. And if you look back, all the great dramas that survived from ancient Greece were performed in Athens and they were written by Athenian dramatists. And the great philosophers were all Athenians. Well, with the exception of Aristotle, he was born up north, but he ended up in Athens, teaching in Athens. So I wanted to find out why. Why do you have these clusters happen? And it turns out, of course, it's more complex than I originally thought, of course. But one of the factors that seems to be very important is that in order to become highly creative, you have to have active mentors and role models in your domain of creativity. It's very hard to come out of nothing. And so you have to have predecessors. And then you build upon those predecessors. And then your successors build upon you. And then you finally reach a peak. And it usually takes about 3 to 5 generations for this to happen, where you finally exhausted that particular style or intellectual paradigm or whatever happens to be, and things have to move on. And of course, eventually what happened is things moved on beyond Italy. Even though Italy still produced some substantial artists, the great artistic movements were not occurring in Italy. They were occurring in Germany and France, moving north, where you had modernism arrive, impressionism and all that kind of stuff. And so you basically had the peak was passed for Italian art, just like the peak was passed for Periclean arts and Athenian philosophy. And what's interesting is this was already recognized in Roman times. It was already recognized that there were peaks and troughs. Occasionally a golden age would be followed by what they call the silver age, where you still have good stuff being done, but it's not at the same level as the earlier stuff.
Is it not at the same, and when you say not at the same level, is it not the same level craft-wise, sort of quality-wise, or is it different-wise, so originality-wise?
It's more the originality thing. In fact, the thing is that craftsmanship tends to go ahead and increase. You know, there's lots of progress in artistic technology, you might say, that doesn't necessarily translate into creativity. So you can have, I mean, the Romans, for example, were producing absolutely phenomenal architecture during the latter part of the empire. Really impressive stuff, gigantic, you know, the Baths of Caracalla, for example. But it wasn't really that original. You didn't really have originality appear in the Roman Empire until you changed the paradigm. And so you still had the engineering, you still had the technology, the stuff that's outlined in Vitruvius, but now you have the emphasis is on Christianity, on saints. And of course, that meant a different design. Instead of designing a temple with a certain shape, you now had the temple had to form the shape of a cross, and you had an apse and, you know, a dome overhead and all these other kind of things. So then creativity rejuvenated, but it wasn't an increase in technology. It was an increase in, or I should say, a shift in the subject matter, in the themes, and what they were trying to do with that creativity. And so that allowed the Roman Empire to overcome a stagnation that occurred in the arts by producing new arts with different themes. But technologically, it wasn't that different. I mean, there's a few technological improvements over time, like in mosaics and whatever, but for the most part, the technology of early Christian art was not a major shift from the later Roman Empire pagan art.
I've read as well that there's a theory that needs to be a certain level of structural, not just, societal resources available to purely be creative. And part of that is also financial support for creativity. So one of the reasons why Florence was this hub of the Renaissance artistic movement was because people were willing to pay for it and invest sums in changing the way that art was produced.
Well, it was no accident that the Medicis were the #1 patrons of Italian art. And not just in Florence, but later on in Rome, when they started supplying popes for Rome as well. And because they were the #1 bankers in Europe. They were super rich. And fortunately for us, they happened to love art. They saw art the way some other wealthy people might see a very expensive sports car or something. That was a way of showing off that they had the money and the taste to be able to patronize people like Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci or Raphael or whatever. And of course, the same thing happened in the Golden Age of Greece. Pericles decided, in his case, it was a little bit of robbery and embezzlement. Athens became sort of the depository of all the dues paid by the members of the Delian League. And he decided, and there was a little justification for it because Athens suffered a lot from the wars with Persia. They had their buildings destroyed on the Acropolis and whatever. And so he felt he could justify using part of that money to rebuild the Acropolis, the Parthenon, and all that kind of stuff. And but there was the money there, the resources, so that Phidias would be welcome to stay there and make a gigantic statue of Zeus and whatever. So yeah, you have to have that, but it's not sufficient to maintain it. And so just like the example of I gave earlier, the Roman Empire was very, very wealthy, but the money didn't buy creativity. And we have a number of periods in history where money is thrown at things, but it doesn't produce any real major golden age. So it's necessary, but it's not sufficient to produce creativity. You need other things going on there. And another example I'd like to give is in Islamic civilization, the Arabs were converted to the Muslim faith. Quite surprisingly, even to themselves, they end up conquering huge parts of North Africa and, getting to the gates of Constantinople, Asia Minor and so forth, Persia, all the way to the Indus. They became very wealthy. They decided to set up all these palaces in Baghdad. And one of their caliphs said, there's all this wealth of knowledge here for all these civilizations. We have the ancient Greeks, and we have the Persians, and we have the Egyptians, and there's just lots of knowledge and wisdom here, even all the way to India. And so he said, I'm going to build a house of wisdom where we're going to translate all the world's philosophy and literature. And in fact, the story goes that he would pay translators by the weight of the books that they produce. He put that in a scale, and then he put gold coins on it. That's probably apocryphal, but there was a tremendous investment. And so all of a sudden, out of the blue, the Arabs did have a great poetry, pre-Islamic poetry, but they didn't have a philosophy. They didn't have a major prose literature, fiction, or anything like that. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, in the Arabic language, you have all the great literature and philosophy available in the ancient world, mathematics, science, and whatever. And so out of the blue, there was a major spurt of creativity based on this house of wisdom. And but the problem is over time, it gets used up. And towards the end of Islamic civilization, they became less open to new ideas. And the creativity basically dried up. I actually have a study where I've documented this. And this is a thing that generally is very important. And that is that civilizations become more creative when they become more open to the ideas of other civilizations. And that was true of ancient Greece. They were open to like the arts of Egypt and the arts of Persia. I've already given an example of Islamic civilization. I did this one study looking at Japanese civilization. And Japanese civilization is very interesting because, it's isolated on some islands. So it was very easy, if they wanted to close themselves off from other cultures. There were periods of Japan where if you landed on the shore, you were executed. and they didn't allow Japanese to go across the ocean to visit Korea or visit China. And there are other periods where they opened up and they allowed, like Jesuit missionaries. They allowed, obviously, Buddhist priests to come in. And what I showed that after about 1 or 2 generations, when there's been a major influx of alien ideas from the outside, mostly from India, China, and Korea, you saw, and later on, of course, the West, okay, there was a major burst in creativity in Japan. But when they closed to the outside world, their creativity eventually dissipated. You eventually use up that impetus.
It's fascinating to think that what happens at a society or general population level, this openness to new ideas, is actually paralleled by the scientific studies at an individual level, that people who are more open to new experiences also seem to have higher creativity scores.
Yeah, it's very similar. It's extremely very similar. It's what's happening at the societal level is the same thing as what's happening at the individual level. I was just reading this morning, just by chance, a study that was done. Most of the earlier studies were done of like Americans studying abroad, for example. But this is a study that was done of Chinese studying abroad, studying in the United States or studying in Europe. And what they looked at is the impact of on what they call dialectical thinking. Their definition of dialectical thinking is, can you think about two opposite ideas, obviously contradictory ideas, and think of them as both possibly being true?
That's tough.
Kind of interesting idea, right? Yeah, that's tough. And what they found in the study, like I only read the abstract this morning. I haven't read the details. Is that what they found is that sure enough, when Chinese studied abroad, these are mainland Chinese studied abroad, they increased their capacity to engage in dialectical thinking. And also similar to what we've seen in the other studies, the earlier studies, if you remind them of their experiences abroad, can you tell me about what it was like your daily life in England, your daily life in Berlin, or whatever it happens to be? That increased their openness to contradictory ideas. Okay, because obviously when you get back to China, you're going to fall back on one single culture, one single perspective. That's just the natural course of things. So these are obviously related. And in fact, for the study I did of Japanese civilization, one of the measures I had of openness was the number of significant figures they had in China, Japanese civilization, who had studied abroad, who had studied in China or studied. So the two things are intimately related, both at the individual level and at the social cultural level.
So let's say we've seen that for creativity to flourish, the environment needs to be supportive of it. There needs to be enough pent-up knowledge, technology, experience previously to support it. But we always come back to this idea of the geniuses who are actually doing the creative work. And this is where I'd like to find out your insights about what exactly is a genius, and are they fundamentally different than anyone else? Is there anything that people get either right or wrong about this stereotype about the lone genius?
Well, first of all, let me just say, geniuses are human beings. They're Homo sapiens, just like the rest of us. They will tend to have high IQs, but not necessarily the highest IQs. They're not going to necessarily be someone who, is 4 standard deviations above the mean, like a 4 Sigma society. They do have to be intelligent enough to master the material of the domain in which they demonstrate creativity. And we know that certain domains are very demanding intellectually. If you want to become a theoretical physicist, you better be very, very smart, And there's actually evidence showing that theoretical physicists have higher IQs. What group will I pick on? I'll pick on my own group, psychologists. we can't help it. You don't need as high of an IQ to become a psychologist as you do to become a theoretical physicist. I'll confess that, okay? Maybe that's why I was actually a chemistry major initially, and that's probably why I didn't continue and dropped out and became a psychology major. So IQ is important, but they're not necessarily these super brilliant people that blow you away, by their super intelligence or whatever. But what they do have is a tremendous interest and fascination, preoccupation with their domain. They love it. They are fascinated with issues and questions, often that arose when they're very young. One of the common examples that's given of Albert Einstein was at age 16. Imagine this. At age 16, he already knew he wanted to become a physicist. And he started thinking about the implications of Maxwell's equations for electromagnetics. Okay.
But one issue that I have, and that probably a lot of my listeners have, is we're not Einstein.
Right.
If we want to be creative, does that mean that if we don't have an IQ like Einstein did, that we should just quit now and become janitors, or what's the?
You have to have a lifelong fascination with a domain. If you're an artist, that's all you want to do is you want to do art. If you're a writer, you want to write. That's what you want to do. If you're a poet, you want to write poetry. And Einstein wanted to do theoretical physics. And then I should point out, we tend to idolize Einstein and think he's like some kind of, God almost. But Einstein had some major intellectual failings. And probably the most remarkable is he spent 35 years, the last part of his career, on what was called the unified field theory, in the English translation, the unified field theory. And it never succeeded. And so he wasn't perfect. He wasn't this immaculate genius. Okay.
Now, I've read some other research from you that seems to correlate our natural abilities with our creativity. And I think you sort of did some analysis showing how much of our creativity is related to our nature, our genes, basically the hand we're dealt at birth. And you found, like some other studies as well, the majority of our creativity is actually determined by other factors, not just the genes we're born with, but instead the nature, the environment, the support network, whatever it might be that we experience as we grow up. Is that true?
Yeah, it's true. It's hard to partition it. This whole nature-nurture issue is very, very difficult because people want to say, okay, it's this percentage nature and this percentage nurture, this much your genes and this much your experience. And you can't partition it that way because very early in life, your genes start influencing what kind of environment you have, okay? And then that environment feeds back into the development of your genes. So one particular interesting example of that is in behavioral genetics, where they use this great paradigm where they study identical twins reared apart. And these are identical twins who were separated at birth and sent out to different families. And one of the things that's really peculiar is that over time, if you look at their IQ, for example, over time, their IQs become more similar to each other than to their foster sibs. And it actually starts converging. And one of the reasons why it starts converging is that they start constructing their environment to be more consistent with their genetic makeup. So let's say they happen to inherit a high IQ. And we know IQ has very high credibility. Okay, it's more than 50%. A lot of estimates put it close to 80%. Okay, and then you have the other 20% we can argue about. Okay, but what happens is there you are. You're obviously very, very smart, and then you say, "Mom, Dad, I want some more books for my birthday." I'm tired of reading the dumb books we have on the shelf, Can't we have some math books? Things like that. And so they start constructing their lives to be consistent with their genetic makeup. Now, the thing is, the genetic makeup is obviously important, but they have to get that environmental input as well. I mean, a good example of that in the case of historical genius is Pascal, who his dad had a really nice library, and he allowed his son to go into that library, and his son discovered Euclid, geometry, and he just loved it. He just fell in love with it, and started studying it and studying it and studying it. And his dad, when he found out what was happening, got very, very upset because he said, "Son, there's so much Greek here, and there's so much Latin here, and here you're reading Euclid, And so he actually forbid his son from reading more mathematics. So you know what his son did?
He read more mathematics.
He didn't read more mathematics. He invented more mathematics. He took off from where he left off in Euclid and developed his own geometry based on Euclidean geometry. He had to invent some of his own terms for things and what have you. But when his dad realized what he was doing, he says, forget it. You're obviously good at math. You can read much math as you want. Okay. So the point is, he obviously inherited a certain proclivity for mathematical reasoning. And we know that that's got a certain genetic endowment to it. And so he wanted to learn as much as he could about it. And by 18, was it 16? I can't remember. He was a teenager, late teens. He wrote a paper on mathematics that was shown to Descartes, and Descartes didn't believe it. He didn't believe it was written by a teenager. He said, it was his father that did this. You can't convince me. And of course, Descartes was a great mathematician. Okay. So the point is that it's an interaction between your genetic endowment and your external environment, where your genetic endowment is influencing your environment, and then your environment is influencing the development of your genetic endowment. Obviously the environment's going to be a factor. If you are innately tall, you're not going to become an NBA player unless you have lots of opportunities to play basketball. It's just not going to happen. There's a lot of poor folks, who are very, very tall, and then they're asked by college classmates, "Oh, you must play basketball." I never really got a chance to. And you're not going to develop that talent without the environmental inputs. And so the bottom line is, we can say it's about 50-50, but that statement has no meaning. Because once you start having the interaction between your genes and your environment take place, they sort of contaminate each other. They become fused in a way.
I think a lot of people, when they think about genius, a lot of issues around creativity, and especially self-perception of creativity, comes to this word perception. They look at other people, the people held in high regard, like Michelangelo, like Einstein, like Beyonce nowadays, or when I do keynotes, a lot of people say Steve Jobs or Elon Musk. They look at the big C creatives who have changed the domain, and they compare themselves to those people, and therefore hold themselves personally in a lower regard and think they can't be creative. To what degree do you think that everyone has the ability to be creative, or even a genius in whatever domain they might be more suited to, even if mathematics isn't their strong suit? Maybe it's more artistic.
Well, you got to remember, the examples you use, Steve Jobs is a great example. He was into aesthetics, elegance. He was really big on fonts. I had one of the earliest so-called portable PCs. It was a compact, and the fonts were terrible. It was this very mundane kind of things like a dot matrix printer would print out, And I don't know if listeners know what a dot matrix printer is. I dated myself, but in any case, he was really into that aesthetics, and so he wasn't being an Einstein. He wasn't being a Michelangelo. He was being a Apple genius, a Steve Jobs genius. And of course, later on, when Apple got in trouble after they kicked him out, they had to bring him back on, to save the company. And so he was able to create a niche for himself that didn't really exist before. And this is a good way of overcoming, the intimidation of, these big idols and all that kind of thing. Is a lot of times there are niches left. There were people who said, like with regard to Newton, Isaac Newton. I'm trying to remember. I think it was a French physicist, Lagrange, who said, "Unfortunately for us, there's only one universe, and Newton discovered it." And so all we have left to do is little minor details, pick up the pieces, and the problem with that idea is that, guess what? That may be true for physics, in particular mechanics and celestial mechanics. But chemistry still had a long ways to go, and so did biology. So there was still room for Charles Darwin, you know, whose Origin of Species did for biology what Newton's Principia did for physics, you know. So it's finding that area where you could be a genius, where you haven't been preempted, you haven't been co-opted, and you know it could be intimidating. So this is a great story of Johannes Brahms, who put off writing a symphony until he was 50 years old, and even then he only wrote 4. And he tried several times, but it ended up one attempt became a serenade, another attempt became a piano concerto. He just couldn't do it. And he finally admitted, says, you don't know what the likes of us feel when we hear a giant like Beethoven tramping behind us. You know, it was intimidating. And it's interesting that Brahms' first symphony is often called Beethoven's 10th, because it ends with a theme that sounds very much like the Ode to Joy theme. And Brahms even admitted it. He basically had to pay homage before he could go on. And even then, he could only do four symphonies. So the bottom line is we all have the potential, but we got to find that special thing, you know, that poetry that sets us apart, some ideas for novels that set us apart. And it's hard to find that. You know, a lot of times we just end up imitating.
Absolutely. I mean, sometimes great artists steal, amateur artists copy. That's a famous saying.
Professor
Simonton.
Picasso. I'm sorry, Picasso's a good example of that. In fact, he's the one who's often quoted as saying that.
Yeah.
Picasso, towards the end of his life, a lot of people say he ran dry because he started doing paintings of classical paintings. Okay, and interesting that Stravinsky did something similar towards the end of his life. He started writing music in the 12-tone system of Schoenberg, which he had totally repudiated as long as Schoenberg was alive. So the point is that sometimes that's what happens, is that you reach a point where you've exhausted. It's sort of like what happens in civilization, where the civilization is, you know, at the tail end, it's gone past the Silver Age, and it happens to individual creators. They reach a point where I've exhausted what I can say in that style, and I either change my modus operandi or I'm going to stagnate.
I think that brings me perfectly to my last question, Professor Simonton. It's been wonderful speaking with you, but I think we're coming up on time, and therefore I want to leave the audience with an insight that they might find inspirational. You just mentioned some of these famous geniuses had to change their output over their lifetime. I think when a lot of us look back or look at contemporary geniuses, it all seems so easy for them. They had this amazing idea in a moment of inspiration, the eureka moment, and they changed the field. But what is the reality about hard work and genius, or how long it takes to actually not just reach your own style, but reach your creative peak as a genius?
It's hard work, and you know, people don't, you know, like Beethoven. We actually have a lot of sketches that survive for his works, and it's amazing how much pain he went through. Just for example, just to compose the final coda, the final few measures of the first movement of his Fifth Symphony, his famous blah 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 blah, and he kept on revising it. He wasn't satisfied with it. He kept on making it longer and longer and longer and more dramatic, until finally he realized the problem was, it wasn't that it wasn't long enough. The problem was it was too long. And so then he went in the opposite direction and made it shorter. And then he finally found a solution. So in his opera, he only composed one opera, it's Fidelio. He composed 4 overtures for it. And what's interesting is the first 3 overtures, Leonora 1, 2, and 3, are basically revisions of the same overture. And then all of a sudden he decides to drop it and compose an entirely different version of the overture, starting from scratch. It wasn't easy. Michelangelo, he'd be working on a block of marble, and then all of a sudden say, this is not working, and then he'd take a sledgehammer to it. So Picasso, he's working on something, and then he says, I'm wasting a canvas here, and paints over it. It starts all over again. It's not easy. You have to be willing to fail. That's my number one advice, fail.
Be willing to fail and realize it takes time, sometimes 10,000 hours, sometimes less, sometimes more, but you need to keep working at it.
Yeah.
Professor Simonton, it's been absolutely fascinating speaking to you, especially having known your work for so long. If people want to find out more about you, your work, your books, or just what's on your mind, what's the best place they can go to find out more?
I would say in the most recent book, The Genius Checklist, each chapter is a checklist. I mean, you can ask you a question about your birth order or your intelligence or whatever, and then it actually gives the reasons in a very accessible way. It reviews the literature, but the literature citations are all in the back of the book. So you don't have to worry about footnotes or anything like that. But I made it deliberately to be a very, very accessible book to anybody who wants to know if they become a creative genius. Published by MIT Press in 2018. It's now in Chinese, Japanese, Polish, almost every major language I can think of, in case your English is not that good.
Perfect. I'll make sure to get a link down to that below. Professor Simonton, it's been wonderful speaking with you, and I really look forward to speaking again with you soon.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks, Nicholas. It was great.
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked it, please like, share, and subscribe, and leave me a comment about what you thought and what you'd like to see more about. If you want to take your creativity and innovation capabilities to the next level, then invest in yourself with the premium training only available at ideatovalue.com. These exclusive training modules have all been put together by me, Nick Skillicorn, and have been used by thousands of artists, innovation leaders, and CEOs to become better at understanding the source of their creativity and executing on their innovation ambitions. And there is no risk to you, as they are backed by our money-back guarantee. Now, don't forget to go out there and make your ideas a reality. See you again soon.